Hello, I'm Natasha Silverman. I'm a relationship counsellor, a couples and sex therapist from London and the Cotswolds, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to talk about sex and intimacy. This is a topic that is so difficult for so many people to talk about openly, and particularly against the backdrop of a chronic illness. I'm really pleased that I've got the time to talk with you about this today. I only have 20 minutes, so I'm going to try and make it count. So firstly, a little health warning. We all have a relationship to the topic of sex and intimacy. So take care of yourself during this presentation. And if you need to take a break at any time, please do. So we're all going to come to this conversation with very different feelings around sex and intimacy. And some of the words on this slide might resonate with you. It might be that some people are feeling very curious and interested about this talk. Others might feel that sex is quite a heavy topic for them at the moment. It might feel quite complicated. And it's important to say that however you feel, it's completely normal and absolutely fine. So something that we probably all have in common is that we received a pretty rubbish sex education. Now, this is improving for some people, but for the most part, I hear different versions of the same stories from my clients. Something along the lines of, my parents gave me a book about the birds and the bees when I hit puberty, or they describe a biology lesson where they learned about reproduction, and the boys and girls were separated in the class. It tends to be that sex education is very much focused on the mechanics, how babies are made, and crucially, how not to get pregnant and how not to catch infections. And that tends to be the most that people get in terms of a sex education. And that's a problem, because beyond baby making, there are actually a lot of motivating factors for people to want to have sex. And one of those is pleasure. And very rarely is that discussed in any formal sex education setting. And that's particularly true for people who have a vulva, because your clitoris is not required for reproduction. It isn't needed to make a baby. So why would it come up in that biology class around how pregnancy works and how babies are made? So what goes unsaid and unseen is often just as powerful as the direct messages that we receive. So parents are often very embarrassed, somewhat understandably, when you consider the stigma and the shame that exists around sex. And talking about sex with their children can feel quite difficult. And so children might hear things like, "You're not old enough for me to answer that question," or "I'll tell you when you're older." And while that's understandable, it does plant the seed for secrecy and shame around the topic of sex. And furthermore, there are specific groups that are very much underrepresented in the mainstream media. So notably, disabled and chronically ill people don't often see themselves in lead roles or romantic storylines. And again, this will fuel that stigma, and the lack of visibility can very easily be interpreted as, well, if I'm not included, I'm not worth including. Or people like me can't be seen as sexual. And we know that is very, very much not the case. So what happens when we don't talk about sex and when we don't get a good sex education? well, that silence is filled by lots of myths and tropes and misconceptions from all sorts of places. Some of them are listed here on this slide. Throwaway comments from family members can be really powerful for children and for teenagers while they're learning about sex. And the classic line I hear from clients is, my mother would say, or a female family member would say, you know, men just need far more sex than women. Sometimes you've got to lie back and think of England. And that one comes up frequently in my practice. And it really does plant the seed for sex isn't for you. Sex is for men, and it's something that you have to tolerate. It's a job to do. So that's just one example. But there are lots of other ways that we internalize and are taught various different shame-based ideas about sex. And that also includes TV and movies, the internet and pornography, which is obviously fantasy and not an accurate reflection of how most healthy sex lives operate, especially not every time. And that is a real problem because there are some very common sexual problems that occur in the general population, in people who don't have EDS and HSD. And this list is just some of them. But if we haven't received a good education about sex, an accurate sex education, if we don't understand what it's really supposed to be like, then we're not very well equipped to deal with any obstacles that we come up against. So EDS will invariably present a lot more obstacles. That might be because of pain. It might be because of fatigue. There might be anxiety around worsening symptoms, understandably. A fear of using up spoons. You know, if I've got to see friends later, am I really going to be able to do this now? Am I going to physically be able to go out later? So, you know, there are lots of reasons that living with EDS might complicate your sex life a little bit more than the average person. So I've got limited time with you all, and I think the best way to use this time is to go straight in and break some stigmas, break some of those myths that have built up in the silence that exists around sex. So number one, you can only have a rich sexual life with a partner, and this is a complete myth. And if we're talking about sex and stigma, then masturbation, solo sex, self-pleasure, whatever you want to call it, often comes in at number one in the shame stakes. And this is for various reasons. But if you're comfortable doing so, it's a healthy and natural way to explore your body, to get to know your genital anatomy, what drives desire and arousal for you as an individual. And exploring your body alone can give you more space to be led by your own curiosity rather than following what is often quite a formulaic process in partnered sex. And gaining the self-confidence to be able to tell your partner, if you have one, what it is that you like, what it is that you don't, how you like to be touched, how you don't. And that's so important because so many people, particularly younger generations, are receiving their sex education from unhealthy places. Porn, for example. Now, porn is really enjoyable for a lot of people. It can be really affirmative for a lot of people too, but it does drive some myths and misconceptions. So, for example, Porn would tell you that the majority of women will orgasm via vaginal penetration. In actual fact, it's a real minority of women that can orgasm without clitoral stimulation. So it's really important to be conscious of how your body works, because your sexual partner might not necessarily understand how your individual body does function sexually. Myth number 2, sex is the most important form of intimacy. So lots of couples who come to therapy for problems in their sexual life often articulate difficulties with emotional intimacy and physical intimacy. And the truth is that you're not abnormal if you don't want to have sex with the person that has just rolled their eyes at you, that hasn't made conversation with you for the past, however many hours, because they're distracted by their smartphone. And that's because foreplay doesn't start in the moments before sex. Foreplay starts at the breakfast table. Foreplay starts when you wake up. From the very last time you had sex to the moment you want it again, everything in between counts. And it's really important to keep in mind that if your emotional relationship, if your emotional connection is struggling, it's highly likely that other areas will be too. Physical intimacy, so affection, and that's really important to maintain. And quite often what happens to people when they are experiencing sexual problems is that all physical intimacy stops, all affection stops. And that's often because when one partner initiates any touch, any affection, it can be seen as an initiation of sex. And if you're not in the right place for that, you're not feeling well enough, now's not the right time, whatever it is, it's quite possible that affection will be shut down with the sexual intimacy. So trying to make sure that affection is always, and if this is what you like in your relationship, that affection is a constant, and that it isn't just there when you want to initiate sex or when your partner wants to initiate sex. So this brings us to the next question of what is sex? What does sex mean to you? And how would you know that you'd had it? And for many people, because of the dominant narratives that exist in our society, in our culture, it is only when a penis enters a vagina that sex has happened. And anything less than that is everything else but foreplay. And that's really unhelpful, because it leaves out so many groups who don't operate that way and can't. And so it's really important to recognize that difference, that you can still have sex without sexual intercourse. And there are many, many people who have a really successful, enjoyable, intimate life in the complete absence of sexual intercourse or penetration. So you must keep that in mind, and that can help you see sex in a way that prioritizes play and curiosity and communication, rather than what is quite often very focused on goals and performance-based sexual encounters. Myth number 3. You don't have a sex life if you have EDS or HSD. And clearly, this is completely untrue. But people with all kinds of disabilities often tell me that their condition and the help that they need from others to manage it can leave them feeling quite infantilized and without much autonomy. And I know from personal experience that when I use mobility aids like my wheelchair, strangers will frequently talk about me to the healthy or able-bodied person with me, and it drives me up the wall and leaves me feeling invisible to a degree. So, and I know that that's very much the case for other people too in that situation. So it makes a lot of sense that chronically ill and disabled people are receiving subtle and not so subtle messaging about what they're capable of, or what they should or shouldn't be doing or wanting. But we are all entitled to be sexual beings, to have sexual needs and desires, just as we have physical and emotional wants and needs. But this concept of a sex drive can actually be quite unhelpful too, because it suggests that our interest in sex is either on or off. It's high or low, it's working or it's broken. And actually, we know that that's not the case. And we actually have brakes and accelerators on our sexual desire. And they often work together at the same time. And some people might have more sensitive brakes, and other people might have more sensitive accelerators. So brakes might be, in the average person, I'm in public, this is not appropriate right now. Or it could be, my parents are in the other room. Now in EDS and HSD, it might be that brakes are more likely to be pain. I'm in too much pain for this. I'm too tired. If I do this, then am I going to be able to work later? So it's really important to remember that your brakes and accelerators are working at the same time. And while there will absolutely be times when now is just not a good time, you're struggling, your brakes are definitely going to outweigh your accelerators. That doesn't mean that you can't learn to communicate with your partner about how your accelerators work and what they look like, so that you can start to slowly rewrite the sex life that you have together, rather than just operating on this belief that one of you has a sex drive and the other doesn't, because generally speaking, that isn't how it works. So myth number 4 is that good sex should happen naturally if sexual partners are well suited. And I often hear people tell me that they're just not good at sex. Or it's the opposite, and I'm really great in the bedroom. I always leave my partner satisfied. And I'm always really curious about that, because from what I've seen in my practice, time and time again, what makes a good partner is someone who is willing and able to put down their ideas and their preconceived notions about what a good sexual encounter looks like, and to actually communicate, to ask questions, to be someone that your partner knows can hear feedback. Questions like, what do you like most about sex? What do you like most about our intimate life? How do you like to be touched? What don't you like? If we were to change one thing about our sex life, what would that be? How do we make that even better for you? And asking those questions back to your partner is really important too. So really just remembering that there is no magic recipe for a good sexual encounter. And what does it for one sexual partner is not always guaranteed to do it for the next. And that's particularly true in EDS and HSD, where there are additional things to consider, mobility needs, pain levels, positions that might be more or less comfortable or painful. Number 5, good sex has to be spontaneous. Oh, myth, myth, myth. I hear this all the time. And if TV and film were to be believed, partners magically want to have sex with each other at the exact same time their partner does every single time, which is really convenient. But here in the real world, that isn't really how it works. And it's totally normal for one partner to initiate sex when the other isn't in the mood. And that's completely normal. You know, you're not always hungry at the same time as your partner. You're not always thirsty or in the mood to watch a movie at the same time as your partner. So why would you always be in the mood to have sex with them at the same time? You know, that's just not how it works. And there's also some very interesting research around the difference between spontaneous desire versus responsive desire. So we know that the vast majority of men, 75%, have a spontaneous sexual desire. And that looks like, ding, you know, I'm in the mood because I'm in the mood. Something has triggered that desire and they're ready to go. Whereas the majority of women do not have that after the first 6 months to 2 years of a new relationship. And what they then have is responsive desire. So that is a response to context or to an experience. But what tends to happen is that the partner who has maintained their spontaneous desire thinks the other has lost their sex drive, that it doesn't exist anymore. And actually, that's generally not true. It's just about learning how to bring around that responsive desire, because are you in the mood at the same time as me doesn't generally cut it. You know, that isn't going to make someone feel sexual desire. They have to be turned on. Number 6, and I think this is something that will resonate with a lot of people here. You're a bad partner if you don't feel well enough to be intimate. Needless to say, that is a complete myth. EDS and HSD often affect many, if not every aspect of your life, at least at times, and your sexual life is unlikely to be an exception. So being unwell, being in pain, and living with a condition that is often misunderstood and takes so long to get a diagnosis for, you know, it takes up a lot of energy, mentally and physically. So when you're feeling unwell, which is very frequent for people, for a lot of people with these conditions, you know, it can feel all-consuming and really overwhelming, particularly if you're in a big flare-up or you're having a really rough time of things. And so you're not abnormal for not prioritizing sexual intimacy when you're just simply trying to cope. You know, that is a perfectly reasonable response. But what often happens in this type of situation, and not just with these particular conditions, but in ordinary life too, is that, or rather in a healthy population too, one person becomes the pursuer of sexual intimacy and the other distances. So the pursuer will initiate sex and the distancer will pull away. You know, I can't, I'm in too much pain, I've got too much to do, I'm just not in that headspace, I'm too tired. And over time, this can result in quite a complicated cycle where the pursuer feels chronically rejected, not good enough, lonely. They might wonder what's wrong with them, their partner. You know, logically, they might know my partner isn't well, but they might struggle to really appreciate that in the moment, and it might feel very personal. There can be a lot of shame associated with that. And the distancer often starts to feel really, really pressured. They'll feel like they're not living up to their duty to be a good partner. They might feel guilty. And we know that that in itself can start to become a reason that people avoid sex too, because I should and duty don't tend to be massive turn-ons. You know, people don't tend to really love the idea of having to have sex with somebody. So it's really important to know that you do not owe anyone sex, ever, even your partner. And you are, you know, you must be enthusiastic about consent with your partner or anyone else. And freeing yourself from this expectation and duty can actually feel really liberating and give you more space to want sex for you rather than to want sex because if I do it now, it will buy me a few more days before my partner starts nagging me again. You know, it's a job to tick off a list of household chores. And that's what I see really frequently with couples, regardless of whether or not they have a chronic illness. So the final myth is that what you're going through in your sexual or intimate life isn't normal. And I can tell you confidently that the odds are you are absolutely not alone in whatever it is you're experiencing. You won't be the first person to deal with it, and you won't be the last. And you know, not being alone in this is so important, but the difficulty is that because so much stigma and shame exists around sex, it's not often that you hear people sharing what their experience is. So you can start to feel very isolated and very alone and abnormal when actually, irrespective of whether or not you have a chronic illness, lots and lots of individuals and couples will experience similar struggles. So we've reached the end of our time together today. I really hope that you found it interesting and that you've taken something away from it. As with everything relational, you know, communication is key, whether that's to your partner, to your doctor, if there's something that's interfering with your ability to engage in sex and that's what you would like to do. A friend, a therapist, whoever it is, having a more open dialogue is just paramount to empowering you to have a more fulfilling sex life and intimate life, and often stripping back the sex life that you've built with your partner and redesigning it in a way that actually really works for both of you. And it might not look as you would expect, but that doesn't mean you can't have one that is highly satisfying and fulfilling for you all. Thank you.